really cool addition to the Fujifilm system is dynamic range priority. Now, how does this differ from dynamic range? Well, both dynamic range and dynamic range priority use DR100, DR200, and DR400. They also both have auto feature. Now, the auto feature found in both only allows DR100 and DR200 when making decisions for you. It never gives you the option of DR400. Now, what makes dynamic range priority unique in comparison to dynamic range, where you can manually select the range that you want, the priority is going to make a decision for you based on the strength that you choose, either weak or strong. Not only that, dynamic range priority incorporates your tone curve or your highlights and shadows. So when you select that, as you can see on the right here, I shot it at dynamic range priority strong. You'll see that my highlights and my shadows are turned off. I cannot access them, and I don't have access to dynamic range at the top. Okay. What is actually happening? Well, what I've worked out is that dynamic range priority weak is effectively DR200, and dynamic range priority strong is effectively DR400. What is exactly happening to the tone curve? What's going on there? Because that's, to me, is the most important thing. Whereas if you'd used dynamic range by itself, you would have then manually gone and changed those to suit the image according to whatever dynamic range you chose. So looking at my test images, there's definitely a pattern, and I can actually see what the camera is doing when selecting weak or strong. All right, so in this first image here, if I go turn off dynamic range priority, what happens? Well, you'll see that DR400 is then given to us as the option in dynamic range. That becomes active. But also look at highlight tone and shadow tone. Automatically leaves us at -2 and -2. So that was the adjustment made. Well, that was my initial impression. But have a look at the image. I'm going to go back. I'm going to turn on strong again. Watch carefully. There's more dynamic range in that image than what -2 highlights and -2 shadows are going to give us, plus dynamic range 400. So I think that there's more, that the tone curve is being pushed further than what we have access to in the manual custom settings. So I found this out where I went to another image where I shot dynamic range priority weak. Because in this image, when I turned it off, as I expected, it gave me DR200, which makes sense because weak represents DR200. But look below. Highlight tone, -1. Shadow tone, -1. And that makes sense because it's not as much dynamic range as you'd find in the strong priority, or priority strong, should I say. But again, let me go turn it back onto weak. And you can see I only have the option of weak because that's the way it was shot. You see how the image opened up? See, it has a little bit more dynamic range than simply -1 and -1. So let me go back again, turn it off. Okay. I messed around with this a bit, but what actually came up was that if I go -2 on the shadow tone, keeping highlight tone -1, and I go and turn it back, turn it back on again. Watch carefully at the image. There's no difference. Okay, so what I learned from this is that actually weak is DR200 -1 highlight tone and -2 shadow tone. And on the other image, where the dynamic range priority is strong, I believe that when it's turned, like trying to work it out for what it's actually doing to your tone curve, is that the highlight tone is -2, but the shadow tone is actually -3. But I cannot access it because it's not part of the features. I can only go as far as that. So in short, the most dynamic range you can get out of this camera, you'll find in dynamic range priority strong. It's going to give you more than dynamic range DR400 -2 highlights, -2 shadows. That's what I've seen, and I've done it over a number of images. Now, I could be wrong. It might not do it to every single image this way, but for the test sort of images that I put it through, that's what's happening. So where would we use dynamic range priority? Well, I think it's quite handy in the sense that if you're shooting on the fly and you're moving through quite varied situations, if it's taking control of your highlights and your shadows and giving you the most dynamic range in every single shot, if that's the look you're after, then that's pretty cool, because then you have to only worry about your exposure, getting that right through your EVF. And it'll automatically, especially if you're shooting in an auto ISO mode, it'll automatically work out the ISO you need for the priority that you've chosen. So it's very automated, which is very, very helpful. And I think it's something to consider, especially if you intend to do RAW conversion in camera or use the XRAW Studio, and you're often looking for the highest possible dynamic range, you might want to opt for dynamic range priority over dynamic range by itself. Because in shooting priority, you can turn it off in the Xraw Studio, in your RAW conversion, and then you have access to dynamic range by itself. So it's not like it's a negative, like you can't access something else because you've chosen priority. But if you choose dynamic range only, you don't have access to priority, meaning you can't get that strong, which is the most dynamic range you can get out of the image. Now, the newer Fujifilm X series cameras have tone curve. The older models have highlights and shadows. They're effectively the same thing. They allow you to go -2 highlights up to +4 highlights. They allow you to go to -2 shadows up to +4 shadows. Now, it's counterintuitive in my opinion, because when you're using post-production software and you've been using it for years, you think when it comes to shadows, for example, you think of plus as brightening up your shadows, lightening your shadows. Where in this case, using the Fujifilm camera, minusing your shadows is brightening your shadows. Where plusing your shadows is darkening your shadows. Highlights obviously make sense. Minusing your highlights, just brings those highlights down. And then obviously plusing your highlights, increases your highlights. So that makes perfect sense. It's just the shadows. It takes a bit of time. Unless you've played around with it, you might think that plus shadows means opening up your shadows. It's the other way around. It's minusing shadows that opens up your shadows. Going back to the dynamic range setting, the one thing that I wish Fujifilm cameras could offer was a little bit more range when it comes to minusing your shadows and minusing your highlights. It only goes to -2. And this is where I think some people will still opt to shoot RAW, because you have so much more leeway when it comes to pulling your highlights back on a 14-bit image in post-production software. -2 doesn't always seem enough, all right? It just doesn't quite get it there in a lot of situations, and that's why you should consider using, where you can, the dynamic range setting of DR400 or DR200, giving you that little bit more extra dynamic range. So sometimes where you thought base RAW ISO would have been good at DR100, you might want to consider go DR400, raise it up by 2 stops your ISO, get that extra 2 stops in there, plus the -2 that you can add in the settings, and you really might be able to expand that process JPEG dramatically, almost as much as though you would have done it in post-production software. So just play around with those things until you get it right. Now, to talk about highlights and shadows, this is kind of why I shoot RAW only. And I don't want to be talking down to anyone who shoots JPEG. That's not the point. You know already from my first video that there's many pros to shooting JPEG, and there's cons to shooting RAW. But the weak point is that in one particular scene that you're photographing, it's okay to say, well, one particular film simulation would suit that whole scene from behind me all around to what I'm shooting, if it's people, events, weddings, whatever it is. But highlights and shadows is not going to be the same when I'm facing that way as I am going to be facing that way. So I know a lot of people that shoot weddings just straight out of camera. And I'm always fascinated how they exactly do that. Because like when it comes to the setup settings, like parts of the wedding where you're doing bridal shoot and groom shoot, that's fine. You're using flash, you're using all these things you can set up, you've got time. But when you're shooting on the fly, yes, you can expose correctly, but I'm not convinced that the highlights and shadow settings, now you can flick between them pretty quickly, are going to be necessarily where you want them to be in one scene when you need to move very quickly. And yeah, and I think this is where these adjustments like highlights and shadows are very particular, and in particular to photographers who have a little bit more time on their hands. I'm still not yet convinced fast-paced shooting, you can get a beautiful looking image, and I think your client would still be happy with it. But as a perfectionist myself, I know that when I create a recipe with these simulations or whatever it is, and I've set particular things, it's for a particular look, it's for a particular area that I'm photographing. It cannot be for everywhere, and I can't just walk around for 5 minutes using it. And I have to keep making adjustments, and those adjustments then get in the way of my creative flow. The idea of just shooting a raw image and then going back working on it afterwards, to me, yes, it's more work, but I get the images that I really want, and I know that every scene is captured the best possible way, making sure that I get it right in camera with my raw image. So that's just a little bit of information around those sort of highlights and shadows adjustments to these things that kind of holds me back on shooting JPEG only. or even RAW and JPEG, and why I'm a RAW only shooter. But nevertheless, that's just my opinion. And I know a lot of people who produce amazing work, which is JPEGs out of camera. So it's just my little rant. And to follow up on this issue I have with using a profile, you might have set it up for this particular scene, you turn around and it's totally different. And you're battling to be able to just quickly change these different things. The camera does offer you a quick menu, and this can negate a lot of this issue. So in the quick menu, you have customizable sort of panels, the entire panel, where you can choose a film simulation, all the settings around that film simulation, and all you got to do is hit the Q button and flick between C1 to C7, C1, C2, C3, and you can program them all beforehand. Now, you hear a lot of people talking about, well, create a different recipe or different profile film simulation for each one. I would personally consider maybe taking 2 that you like. Let's just say you're going to an event, and over 6 or 7 of those customizable panels, and rather choose, say, for example, C1, C2, C3, the same film simulation, but set one up for high contrast, C2 set it up for mid-tone settings, C3 set it up for low contrast settings, and then another film simulation, the same thing, and another, there's only be 2 simulations over 6 because you've got 7 options. In that way, the focus is not so much on the look that the film simulation gives you, but how to set up your highlights and shadows to give you the best results for the conditions around you. That way you can flick through it quickly. So if I'm this way and it's sort of contrasty, sun's coming in this side, and I turn and it's a lot less contrasty, all I've got to do is hit the Q menu and go to C2, and that might suit that situation better. That way I think that you can move pretty quickly shooting JPEG only and sort of cover cover every scenario that's there, or at least to a high degree, than trying to do it in camera while you're shooting. Another feature that they offer is film simulation bracketing. Now, we've all heard of exposure bracketing, focus bracketing, ISO bracketing. A lot of these bracketing situations where you push down the shutter and it takes 3 shots with different exposures. What's unique about the film simulation bracketing is it's one exposure because it's raw capture with the raw information, but the camera processes 3 different film simulations. And you set film 1, film 1, film 2, film 3, however you want them. And every shot that you take, it creates 3 film simulations. And then you can go afterwards through your images and choose the best one of the 3. One thing to mention when it comes to doing film simulation bracketing is, yes, it does create 3 separate JPEGs with those 3 separate film simulation looks. But if you're shooting RAW plus JPEG, the camera creates and records 3 separate RAW images for each one of those JPEGs. Now, I would have way preferred if it just created 1 RAW, because you only need 1 RAW, because it's exactly the same capture, and then gone and produce or process those 3 separate JPEGs. But obviously, that's a lot easier said than done. Obviously, the camera needs a separate RAW for each one of those JPEGs to be created. I'm not sure exactly what's happening in camera, but I just wish we can get to a stage where, the camera would just create that 1 RAW image, and then from there process 3 different looking JPEGs. So just remember, when you're shooting RAW and JPEG and you're using this bracketing, you're going to fill up your cards very, very quickly. If it was just 1 RAW and 3 JPEGs, it would be far better on the card from a space perspective, but that's not what it does. It creates 3 of both. So just bear that in mind. I'd love to see Fujifilm expand on film simulation bracketing. The idea of shooting 3 different simulations is all cool, but that needs to be taken further. I think it's less useful to see 3 different simulations than it is to see the same simulations with 3 different ranges of recipe or settings. That to me is way more beneficial. I'd rather have, in the film simulation bracketing, it gives you access to the film simulation films all listed there, but none of them are the recipes that you've created. None of them are from the Q menu, C1, C2, C3, C4. Why can't you bracket those? Okay. Why can't you have a setting where you can set the bracketing to 3 different recipes, and then every shot that you take applies those recipes, but very quickly you can just flick between simulations that apply to the bracketing. So you come across a scene and it looks like a Provia scene. You set it to Provia, take the shot. 3 Provias are created with a low contrast, mid contrast, high contrast, all created at the same time. So afterwards you can just choose. Wouldn't that be quicker? Just flicking between the simulation and align the settings to produce 3 different ways on the bracketing? Or at least have C1, C2, C3 available on your bracketing, so you can set that up in the Q menu as the same simulation, and then it produces 3 JPEGs. The only drawback there is that you can't quickly change the simulation as associated with C1, C2, C3. You would have to go to the Q menu, go to the film simulation part and change the film simulation. That might take too long. But there's certainly room to expand on this. I think that Fujifilm, if you can get on top of this, you could take the camera to the next level where people start moving away from RAW shooting even further, because you're just giving them more options, a better safety net. They feel more secure knowing that they have a bigger variety being created in camera with their JPEGs. The last three settings I'm going to talk about, and there are more settings, but these are the ones that are important for this particular conversation, is color sharpness and noise reduction. Now, they're pretty self-explanatory. It really does require that you just go out and experiment with them. Understand your film simulation in relation to the color. So if you're going to push color, which is in sort of pushing your saturation, there's certain film simulations that you don't have much leeway when it comes to doing that. And some of them you can actually push them quite hard. Same applies to sharpening and noise reduction as well. A lot of these recipes you see going around creating really beautiful JPEGs, noise reduction is quite often reduced quite dramatically. And sharpening as well is also reduced. So when it comes to sharpening, the camera does the best job at sharpening. There's no doubt about it. In-camera processing of sharpening is amazing when the JPEGs are produced. And I think is one of the key things to why the Fujifilm JPEGs look so good. It's not just the transitions between the tonal values in those JPEGs, that really beautiful smooth look that they get, but it's also the sharpening. Compared to Lightroom and Capture One, it's way better. I am aware of the difference between Lightroom and Capture One. I know some people have informed me in the comment section. Don't stress, I do know about it. I know the shortcomings of Lightroom. It's just when you've shot for as long as I have, and you have just in one of the genres that I do is weddings, I have 550 weddings under my belt. It's not easy to change software when you have to catalog or change over catalogs, to that degree. You've got that many catalogs that you've put together. So I have different ways in which I sharpen in post-production to try to get the best out of my images in Lightroom. But nothing can beat what the camera can do when it comes to sharpening. So understand sharpening, work it to your advantage. Don't over sharpen. Remember, whatever you set is going to get baked in when it produces and processes that JPEG, and you're stuck with it. Sharpening is one of those things you can't really unsharpen. So just, be subtle with it when it comes to using that.